Hey everyone, it's your instructor Hannah DeWitt back with another pre-recorded lecture. Now this one I'm quite excited for, but also a little bit overwhelmed just because it is a lot of subject matter to be covering in one lecture. When I took my art history, it was split up into, I had a full class for 3 different sections of art history, and I was in art school, so obviously I had a more intensive art history education in my undergrad, whereas you guys are in an art appreciation course for non-majors, so we're just kind of blowing through everything really quickly. But to give you an example of how much there is to cover in this, I took pretty much an entire class on everything that we're about to unpack right now. So everything that we're cramming into one lecture could be blown out to an entire class. And that is like the way that they intend for us to teach this to you. This is not my choosing, unfortunately. They really want us to cover all of art history and do art making and have time for critiques and discussions and stuff. So I apologize in advance if you get whiplash from just how fast we're going to be going through some really interesting parts of art history. But on the bright side, there is a lot of really interesting stuff in this one, and we're starting to get closer to the modern era, and the closer we get to the modern era, the more I actually know about art history, so I'll have more interesting commentary as we go on from here. So I'm rambling. Let's just go ahead and start. I just wanted to warn you guys that this is gonna be kind of an intense one in terms of just how much content is being crammed in here. So feel free to pause the video and take breaks. You don't have to watch it all at once. But yeah, this is chapter 17. This is on Renaissance and Baroque Europe. That's kind of simplifying it. We're going to be going over early Renaissance, high Renaissance, Mannerism. We're going to be going over the life of Artemisia Gentileschi, Baroque, and then from Baroque and kind of dipping our feet in still lives along the way. And then finally reaching Rococo at the end. So, yeah, it's a lot. Strap in. Now, I wanted to start with this slide that my cohort Erica Lewis made. This is actually the only slide from Erica Lewis that we'll be using today, but I just really liked how they kind of laid out what we've gone from to get to here in terms of what we just covered in the last lecture and how it kind of leads up to the Renaissance. So, this is what Erica has to say. The ancient Greeks idealized the physical form. Then we get into the Romans, who have more of an emphasis on physical accuracy. And then we move into the Middle Ages, and spiritual concerns go over top of physical existence in terms of what's valued. There's more value on spiritual concerns, specifically a lot of value placed on Christianity in the art world. And then we get to the Renaissance, which is when we have the attention shift from heaven to earth, with Christian subjects in human terms. So basically, we're kind of reeling it back in and making it be more based on things that are in earth, or on earth, but there'll still be Christian or Catholic, or any different type of thing under the Christian umbrella. There's still a lot of that imagery from biblical stories and references, but instead of just trying to portray and arguing about how do we portray God? Oh, you can't portray God. You have to you have to paint white over anything that has Jesus in it and things like that. Instead of arguing about that as much, we start thinking more about what's happening on earth. And if there is a painting or a sculpture with a biblical reference, it's usually just that. It's a reference, and it's more focused on the actual form of the painting or sculpture. And it's more focused on, portraying that emotion or portraying the body, the anatomy of the person. So we'll see that as we go on. And just like last time, I want to start things off with a bit of an outline of sorts. This is loose, but the main points we're going over are the Renaissance, which is focusing on technical advances with profound subject matter. Baroque, which expanded the means of producing works and got into some darker subject matter. And then we're going to finish off with Rococo, which is more decorative and playful. It's an elaboration on the Baroque, but it's like Baroque's cute pastel younger sister. So we're going to start with Renaissance because, chronologically, that's where it starts. What is the Renaissance? Quite literally, the word Renaissance means rebirth, and it is this new surge in humanism. Now, humanism is this new, or at least it was new at the time, philosophical, literary, and artistic movement where people focused on humans, not the divine. And there was a lot about what can human intellect and can the human mind achieve. And so there was this great boom in science and research, and also the arts at the same time. And this is when people call the time before the Renaissance the Dark Ages, and that's mainly in reference to the fact that Renaissance is when everything was like shed a new light upon, because we realized that we could be Christians and also do science and, learn about what anatomy is and what it means to be a person. And you don't have to only do one thing. You can also, talk about philosophy and work through reason. And it's this great big realization that we could do science, basically. So this was very much a time of achievement, exploration, and rediscovery of older ideas. There was a renewed interest in the ideas of classical Greece and Rome that we had already been dipping our toes into then, but now it's all really coming back full swing. Now, an important thing to note about the early Renaissance especially is that there was recovery of ancient works from Muslim scholars. So Italians believed that they were responsible for the rebirth of classical Greek and Roman ideas, but in reality, these ideas hadn't actually gone away per se. They just weren't in the Western culture at the moment, or at least the Western culture that is most written about in art history. Muslim scholars in Spain, Egypt, and Iraq kept the tradition alive in the meantime, this tradition of classical Greek and Roman ideas, before Italy brought it back to the sort of global popularity that it had in the Renaissance. These Muslim scholars liked the Greek and Roman ideas a lot and translated those written works to Arabic for their libraries. And it was actually only because of this that many of the written works were even able to be recovered and translated back into Latin, then translated into other languages as well. So really we have Muslim scholars to thank for the Renaissance just as much, if not more, than Italians. That's just some food for thought. Other things to note about the early Renaissance are the elevation of individual artists. Instead of the sort of anonymity that Middle Age artists had, they were considered more like, it was considered a job like any other, like being the town doctor. I mean, it didn't have the same, honor as a doctor, but it was just like, being the blacksmith or being the butcher, you're the artist. And there wasn't really this sort of fame to artists per se until the Renaissance, where people started really getting interested in individual artists. Also, there's this resurgence of realism, and also realism coming forward in a way that we had never actually seen it before. People were figuring out how to make things look more realistic. And it was kind of, early on in art history, there were all of these developments to be made. It was like people were figuring out for the first time what's the best way to do it. So depictions of light, space and mass that emphasize physical reality were really focused on. Here is an example of some early Renaissance art, and you can see how it still is a bit stylized, like Byzantine art, a little bit flat, and you can see how it's early in the Renaissance, but we're starting to move more towards this Renaissance style that we've all kind of gotten used to. But it is Giotto di Bondon's Lamentation, and it does have to do with both physical and spiritual realism. So it is trying to realistically portray these human forms while having spiritual content. Now, when we think early Renaissance, we definitely think of Italy. And specifically in Italy, part of what pushed this movement forward was that merchants started to get wealthy. There started to become a little bit more of a middle class, a little bit more of people having expendable income that they could spend on things like art. And this enabled some competition in the form of art patronage. Now, if you're wondering what a patron is, a patron of the arts, or what patronage is, it's basically someone who has enough money to commission works, so they have kind of the power. If they don't like what the artist makes, then they can be like, oh, I'm not going to pay you for it. I mean, in reality, this is how you do it now. You like pay the first half up front and then the second half later, so that they can't just be like, I'm not going to pay you for any of it. But still, it's the same kind of concept where if you're the one commissioning it, it's really made to your liking. So you very much have the control over what the subject matter is. And in this way, it just goes throughout history. I mean, obviously, the people with money end up having more control, but quite literally, they have more control over what goes down in art history because they're the ones commissioning works, so they're the ones that artists are able to feed themselves because they're, being commissioned from, so they have to do what the patron wants. Anyway, that's a little bit off topic, but this example is the Holy Trinity by Masaccio, and sorry if you heard my dog shaking. This was actually the first painting that we know of to use linear perspective. We've talked about linear perspective a lot in this class, but we finally reached the point in art history in which people figured out how to use it. So there is the vanishing point where all of the lines come together, and that is below the base of the cross. And so these figures look very real, like as if they are standing truly in space because the space around them is so well defined by geometry. So the illusion of figures is well composed in such a three-dimensional space. And also their bodies and the drapery of the fabric around them is quite realistic as well. So all of that added together just results in a much more realistic form of painting than people had been able to do before now. Now, as far as subject matter of this goes, clearly it's Jesus on the cross, but this is the Holy Trinity. I kind of zoomed in a bit, but it's not the highest quality image, so unfortunately you might still not be able to fully see the dove that represents the Holy Spirit. I also do highly recommend, if you can watch this on a screen that is larger than your phone, you really should, because you're not going to be able to see all of the details on just a tiny little screen like your phone. Like, if you can cast it to like a full-size TV, that's ideal, but like a laptop would be fine too. Anyway, that beside the point. If you're able to see it, so there is Jesus on the cross, and then directly above his head there is the dove that represents the Holy Spirit, and then above him is this figure that's supposed to be God. So we've got God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus, and we're kind of working our way from the divine to the more earthly, because Jesus was the earthly version of God, in the sense that he was like the version that like was put on earth and like had a human body and things like that. And then if we're following that train of thought, going from the divine to the more physical, then we can follow it all the way down to this skeleton here at the bottom. And there's actually an inscription above the skeleton, and the translation of that is, "I was what you are, and what I am you shall become." So this is when we first really start to see this memento mori, like warning people about the fleeting nature of life and how death is just around the corner. But don't fret, that's supposed to make you, live your life more fully, just knowing that. But yeah, it is quite literally from the top to the bottom, a transition from divine to human, to the most human thing ever, which is death, or the most living thing ever. All living things die. That's like a part of what it takes to qualify as living, is that you will one day die. So you can really start to see this train of thought go from the divine to the human. Now, another thing that got quite popular in the early Renaissance is the nude subject. This started coming back into style in a way that just people had not done for a very long time because of the heavy influence of early Christian and Byzantine art and stuff. It wasn't about the nude figure, but now it is. Well, not everything, but a lot of things are about the nude figure. So here we have this example. This is David by Donatello. And this is actually the first life-size freestanding nude statue to come out since ancient Roman times. It had been so long since they had done that. And David is a biblical figure, in case you're not aware. The story of David Goliath is that David is like kind of young and scrawny, and no one expects him to be able to fight off this giant named Goliath. And as a series of events unfolds, and he ends up being the one to fight the giant. And he only has stones and a little, what's it called? The thing that you like fling stones with? It's two sticks and a rubber band. I'll put the word in post. I can't think of it. Slingshot. Okay. Sorry about that. He had a slingshot and some rocks, and he somehow managed to take down the giant Goliath. So here he's standing on the head of Goliath. He has severed the head. But this is a very expressive pose. It's derived from contrapposto. If you didn't notice, the kind of shifted hip, the weight being more on one side, that's definitely a contrapposto look. And people think that this was likely a commission for Cosimo de' Medici. A lot of things are commissions for the Medici family. You'll hear that name come up again and again, and that's just because that was a very wealthy, very, very, very powerful family that in Italy that was commissioning a lot of art that is now famous. But something that I want to talk about here actually is the kind of homoerotic nature of this pose and the way that this body is portrayed, despite the fact that this is clearly like a rather young boy. Like I'd be willing to bet that this boy is not 18 yet. And this, I think I mentioned it in a previous lecture, but this is like a perfect example. I mean, I don't even want to say perfect, because why would you call something like that perfect? But there's this very, it was very common, it was very normalized at the time to have homoerotic imagery of young boys. And this was a sort of continuation of the tradition of what people called Greek love, which is a really gross and just not okay by any means thing, but it was very much normalized at the time in ancient Greece, and then people are kind of bringing it back while they're bringing back all of these ideas from ancient Greece. It's like, if you could leave one idea and not bring that one back, I wish you... But anyway, the whole idea is that there's like, you normally go for apprenticeships and stuff when you're looking to elevate your career, and as like a young boy, like not like a little tiny young boy, but like about this age young boy, you'd normally be going to your apprenticeship, and then the idea is that the like master that is teaching you, who is an older man, is teaching you not only about like whatever trade you're learning, but also about sexuality. And it was something that should not have been normalized so much, but it was. And I just wanted to point that out because I think that that is very apparent in this way of portraying, because I feel like this is just like a very sexualized image. I mean, it makes sense that this character is a younger boy because he's David, he's supposed to be scrawny, but if anything, that just seems like he made it be David, who's supposed to be young and scrawny, as an excuse to sculpt this type of body. And yeah, it's a lot to unpack. And you know, the sword itself that he's holding in his hand is a phallus too. And you might think that I'm like overreacting when I'm like, oh, that's Ionic or that's phallic or something. But if I have learned one thing in my art history classes, it's that you're not overreacting or being weird about it. If you think that something is phallic, it probably is, and it's probably on purpose. So don't be afraid to bring that up, because it's probably a part of something that needs to be discussed. You're not a creep or a weirdo for noticing that something looks like that. In fact, it just means that you're thinking critically about things and picking up on those things. So yeah, that's just something that I kind of wanted to cover here because it's gross, but it's very apparent in this artwork. But moving on from that, let's look at more early Renaissance in Italy. This is The Birth of Venus by Botticelli. This was the first large mythological painting since antiquity. For a long time, just the whole idea of everything in art having to be religious in a Christian sense really made it so that no one could make art about mythology. And this was the first time that someone actually brought that back. And so that's really like saying something about the changing of the times in terms of what people's priorities were, and showing the shift to a different way of thinking in the Renaissance. Now, the decorative and kind of flat-looking background actually makes the figures appear to be in relief. Like the fact that the figures are so carefully almost sculpted in their looking three-dimensional, and yet the background is so flat, makes it seem like the figures might be like sculptures popping out or something. But also that very flat background shows some Byzantine influence as well, because we remember how flat and mosaic-y all of that art style was. But I think probably the most important thing to note about this is that this is a pagan goddess. So pagan, basically just the technical meaning of pagan is anything that's not Christian. Now we associate it with things like Norse traditions or Wicca, but quite literally pagan just means not Christian. So this is a pagan goddess in this very modest role that was previously only reserved for Mary. Mary could be the only person ever depicted like this, and they would probably never depict Mary with this much of her skin showing. But you'll notice this pudica pose, again, the Venus pudica that we talked about. It just keeps coming up again and again. And you know, this is the goddess of beauty. Why is she hiding herself? Well, it's because it's more normal for a woman to be ashamed of her body and hide it than for her to stand unapologetically showing her body. It is a sort of fetishized modesty, giving us something to imagine. It makes it more of a tease, like a sort of Playboy centerfold, instead of just unapologetically standing there and not covering yourself. But I'm sure that we have already discussed this in class at this point, and you're probably tired of hearing me talk about it, so I'll move on. But yeah, you can see that this focus on classical mythology is kind of shifting away from everything having to be of biblical reference. And this is actually based on Neoplatonist philosophy, which is pretty much the philosophy of the business-oriented secular art patrons. So the people that were paying for the art and just were focusing on the art market as a market and didn't care so much about it having religious undertones so much as, how much is the value of the art that I am seeing as an investment, because after it is made for me, it will be worth more because this person is so famous and genius. But yeah. And also real quick, I just kind of want to go over a little bit of what you're seeing here. So Venus wasn't born as a baby, according to mythology. She just arrived fully grown from the sea. So this is the scene of her arriving from the sea on this shell, which is not necessarily in the mythology, but a lot of the portrayals of it do have her coming on this shell boat type of thing. But to our left, her right, there is Zephyr, the god of wind, and he's holding a woman. She's supposed to be Aura, who's the personification of a light breeze, but they're both blowing on her they were the wind that blew the waves and blew her to the shore. And then she's being received on our right, her left, by the Hora of spring. Now the Horas were Greek minor goddesses of the seasons, and just the way that this one, the dress that she's wearing, makes us think that it's spring. So she's being blown by the god of wind out of the water and received by springtime, ready to clothe her so that she does not have to stand nude anymore. Now that we've gotten a little bit of early Renaissance, let's talk about the High Renaissance, the sort of prime of the Renaissance. This happened between 1490 and 1530 in Florence, Rome, and Venice. And the three main power players that we think about, the three old masters that come from the High Renaissance, are Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. And we're going to talk a little bit about all of them. So, starting with Leonardo da Vinci, Leonardo da Vinci saw art and science as two means to the same end, and that end is knowledge. So he used art as a way to explore knowledge, to gain knowledge, and to explore science, especially in the form of anatomy. So there are studies, lots of studies in his different sketchbooks of anatomy and ideas for mechanical devices as well. And here is an example. This is the fetus in the womb. And actually, much of this drawing is very accurate. Considering the lack of access to the modern technology that we have today, that's quite impressive. But here is the piece that he is perhaps most well known for. I think everyone is very familiar with the Mona Lisa. Everyone's at least seen this image. But why is this such a famous image? It was actually just a portrait to be made of some random lady, and yet here it is today, wildly popular. Many people think that it's so successful because of her intriguing expression. It's kind of hard to tell what's on her mind. Part of this is because we get a lot of our expressive facial expressions from our eyebrows, and she doesn't seem to have any. But it's she's got this sort of coy, almost smile. She looks like she has a trick up her sleeve, in my opinion. But people can argue all day about what they think that she's thinking about, or what they think this expression means, because it's so ambiguous. And also there's these sort of soft, blurred edges around the figure, and this, combined with the special attention to light and shadow, is kind of like chiaroscuro, but it is a special type of chiaroscuro. It's early chiaroscuro. And like I said, this was a portrait of an individual. This wasn't anyone royal. This was just a random normal person that could afford to have a portrait. So upper middle class type of vibe, probably not like a complete peasant, but still just like a regular person. And this was actually fairly common in ancient Rome. And this also goes back to this idea of humanism, where an individual could be worthy of a portrait. So that is the Mona Lisa. Now let's look at The Last Supper, another very famous piece by Leonardo da Vinci. Now in The Last Supper, Jesus is a human in the Bible. This is the whole idea, is that he's God incarnated into a human, or God's son as a human, I should say. But this is very much a human portrayal of Jesus. He knows that he is about to be crucified soon. And so this shows Jesus as an accessible person who reveals his divinity in an earthly setting. But if we look past that, quite literally past it, there is hidden geometry in here that really strengthens the symbolism. For example, the interior is based on a one-point linear perspective system. We keep talking about linear perspective. But the vanishing point where all of the lines come to is just behind Jesus's head, which makes him the center of everything, symbolic, and also associates him with infinity, because it's what the vanishing point is kind of where you would stop to see something in the far distance, because it like goes off into infinity. So by making the vanishing point be Jesus, it associates him with infinity as well. Also, there are 3 windows behind him, which represent the Holy Trinity. Some have pointed out that there's also 4 doors on each side, and 3 times 4 is 12, and there's 12 apostles. I think that's kind of a stretch, but some people think that that's worth mentioning too, so I'll mention it. And also, another thing, it's kind of hard to see in this version of the image. You'll notice that like different photographs of paintings will look wildly different just from one photograph to the other, even though it's the same painting, and the level of detail will change. And this one you kind of can't see, but there's like a sort of arch over the door behind him, over the large window behind Jesus. That is called a pediment, but it is in the form of a circle. Like, it's the top of a circle, it's an arch, but it makes a circle around Jesus's head that would be a halo. And I'll show you that in just a second. So let's look at this enlarged version, because, you know, you might be looking on a tiny screen. I hope you're not. I hope you're looking on the biggest screen that you can right now. But in case you couldn't see the details, here's a bigger version. And then here is something that shows all of the all of the lines coming to the vanishing point, which is right in the center of Jesus's head, and also the circle that is made by that arch over the doorway or window behind him. So you can kind of see how that creates a sort of illusion of a halo as well. So this is just some examples of just really clever use of geometry to further symbolism. But moving on from that, let's also talk about Michelangelo. People normally just shorten his name to Michelangelo. It's actually Michelangelo Buonarroti, or Buonarroti, but you can just say Michelangelo. I'll know who you're talking about. And he is a bit of a moody virtuoso. He is known for, well, we'll get into it. He created very important works in sculpture, painting, and architecture. He was exposed to examples of earlier Renaissance art in school, so the Renaissance had kind of already started when he started making work. And he preferred sculpture above all else, although you'll see he did lots of paintings as well. And he achieved fame at age 24, which is quite young, for Pieta. Now, Pieta is this piece here. It was put on public display, and he actually signed the work quite prominently, which was a huge break with tradition. It was unheard of for an artist to sign their work, let alone to make it such an integral part of the work that it couldn't be removed. So here I have, at the bottom, a sort of zoomed in image of the, sash thing going across the chest of Mary, and that is where he signed it, so no one could take his signature off it. So we're starting to get into the realm of artists really taking ownership over their own work and focusing on artists as individuals rather than as a sort of anonymous just craftsmen. Now this piece is Mary holding her son Jesus after his crucifixion, and it is, quite draped with emotion. He's very just limply laying there, and this is referenced a lot throughout the rest of art history too, so I just wanted you to at least see this image so that you can pick up on when it's referenced later. But that was sort of the first thing that skyrocketed Michelangelo's career. Now, another piece of his that's quite famous that I want to talk about is the David. This is probably the most powerful depiction of David that we have as of yet, and I don't know if a more powerful depiction of David has come since. It's showing David, the same David that was a young boy that hit Goliath with his slingshot earlier. This is the same David, but it's a very different portrayal. It's portraying him as a hero and a defender of a just cause, rather than a young boy just meant to be such an unlikely underdog to Goliath. And this is quite interesting. It is a very different depiction than we're used to. It took 3 years to finish this sculpture. It's huge. It's 14 feet tall. And the stance, you'll also notice, is in contrapposto, with that sort of weight being shifted to one side. There's also a sense of anxiety and readiness for conflict. I don't know if I see that in his face, but that's what people say his facial expression is. There's a lot of very bland facial expressions up in the early parts of this that people are like, oh, it was so deep, when it's like he's making no facial expression at all, but okay. But anyway, there's also the changes in proportion, making him so much larger and kind of aging him up, making him a lot stronger and more muscly, gives this depiction of a very different inner feeling, a very victorious, strong man type of feeling, which is just so different than what we've seen before. So that's the David. Now, let's talk a bit about why we call him the moody virtuoso. Why is he so moody? What's up with that? So, as far as Michelangelo goes, his contemporaries regarded him as quite difficult. He held most people in contempt. He didn't like really anyone. He never took any students or apprentices. He was very much a loner in that way. He did, however, create many of the most important works for the papacy, or for, the Pope's needs, whatever the Pope ends up wanting him to do, such as the Sistine Chapel, St. Peter's Cathedral, and he was actually named chief architect, sculptor, and painter by the Pope. So he did a lot for the Pope. This is the Sistine Chapel, the creation of God and Adam here. But he didn't really want to. And that's where things get a bit interesting. So we've got the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Pope Julius II ordered Michelangelo to take on the commission, and he didn't want to, but he had to because he was ordered by the Pope. And then it was actually completed under Pope Paul III, who was even more controlling than Pope Julius II initially was. And Michelangelo hated every second of it. He did not like this job, did not want to do it, and he threw as much shade as he could. And that is what brings us to the Last Judgment, which is on the end wall above the altar. And it's what we're seeing on the left here, and then on the bottom right, we've got two sort of like close-ups, because there's so many details. It's crazy. You could zoom in and look at this for hours and hours. But I did want to zoom in on two important details to see. The first is that he put Pope Paul III in hell and had a serpent biting his penis. Now, Pope Paul III was appalled at... appalled, I didn't even mean that, but pun. Anyway, he was appalled at the amount of nudity and said that he had to cover up all of this nudity. And so the way that he decided to cover up the nudity of Pope Paul III himself, where he's being depicted in hell, is by having a serpent just bite his penis off. Now this is really interesting, you know. This is like if in modern day, you know, a very famous painter were to make this great painting, but it like has like scenes of heaven and hell, and then in hell there's just like Kanye West or something, like someone that is alive at the time, that is like a part of the current like pop culture or like culture in general or something. To put someone that is currently alive that you associate with in hell in your painting is just a very bold move. He was very sassy in all of that. He put a lot of people in hell very on purpose and very much copied their likeness so that people would know it was them specifically. Now, one other thing I'd like to point out is that he does have a bit of a self-portrait in here, but it is not what you would expect either. His self-portrait is as flayed skin of Saint Bartholomew, because apparently Saint Bartholomew like had his skin flayed off, so he's like this empty skin sack. Well, apparently this empty skin sack here is meant to be Michelangelo himself. So I think that just goes to show how he felt about the entire process and about what he was being forced to make. So yeah, those are some little details from The Last Judgment. Now, the third and last major artist of the High Renaissance that we're going to be talking about today is Raphael. And Raphael really worked with this warmth and gentleness, especially in his color palette, but was very clear and defined in his line work and brushstrokes and all of that, like making everything very clear as to what it is. And through this, his work most frequently embodied the sort of clarity and balance of the period, this return to logic and reason. Now, probably his most famous piece is the School of Athens, which we've looked at before, but we're going to look at it again because it's just so famous that we just have to look at it even more. This is a very complex composition with symmetrical subgroups going on. There's just a lot to unpack here. And obviously, there's the linear perspective, but we've already talked about this image. Let's talk a little bit about the central figures, which are Plato and Aristotle. Now, I have like a kind of zoomed in version of it so that you can see them a bit more clearly here at the bottom right. Plato is pointing his hand or his finger up because in his philosophy, the changing world that we see around us is just a shadow of a higher, truer reality that is eternal and unchanging. On the other hand, Aristotle holds his hand down because in his philosophy, the only reality is the one that we can see and experience by sight and touch, which is exactly the reality that was being dismissed by Plato. So that's kind of the symbolism here. And I think another interesting thing to note is the purpose of this piece, because this piece was actually commissioned by the Pope at the time to hang in a meeting room where church business was conducted. And I think that this is a perfect example of humanism as well, because religious people were opening up to ideas by more secular thinkers and starting to care more about what the human mind can achieve rather than sticking to tradition 100% of the time. Now let's look at some more work by Raphael. This is Paul preaching at Athens. This was a commission for Pope Leo X, who is actually in this scene. He's just to the left of Paul, to our left. And I think this is another great example of humanism because Paul is preaching Christianity to Athenians here, which were more philosophically inclined than spiritually inclined as a society. And the overall message is that religious truth doesn't have to deny human reasoning and intelligence, And in fact, it can be explained through human reasoning. So this is really what people were trying to get at this time, was this resurgence of logic and science doesn't have to be sacrilege. It can go hand in hand, and this sort of allowed people to have this resurgence of the arts and sciences in that way. Now let's talk a bit about the Renaissance in Northern Europe. So not Italy so much. There was more of a preoccupation with depicting life in the real world for this area. So here is an example. This is by Jan van Ike of Flanders, who was actually one of the first people to use oil as a painting medium. Now oil paint is so well known and popular, but at one point in the early 1400s, it was very new. And with oil paint, you're able to create detail and depth that is more believable than fresco or tempera. And the brilliance or transparency of the color, depending on how much you thin it out, was previously unattainable. It's just better than anything that we had before. So it was like this cool new invention of a way to paint. This example in particular is called the Arnolfini Portrait. There's actually a lot to unpack in this too, but I'm sorry if you heard my dog like groaning. She is sleepy. But anyway, there's a lot to unpack with this, but I'll keep it to the main points. The folded dress here. You'll see that this very long draping green dress is folded up over her stomach to kind of make it look like there's a bulge at her stomach. And this indicates the desire to appear pregnant. And it shows how most beauty standards at the time revolved around portraying fertility. So wanting to look more pregnant than you actually are was quite normal at the time. Also, another important thing to know about this piece is the little mirror in the very back, in the center. The mirror in the back, actually, if you were to zoom in, shows the artist at his easel, which is a clever way of both signing one's work and also showing that the scene is staged, showing that this is people that are posed in front of an artist, and to kind of give that little glimpse of the artist themselves. And this hadn't really been done before either, so it was quite interesting and exciting and new at the time that the artist dared to put himself in the reflection of the mirror, even though it's quite tiny. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about Albrecht Derrer. Now, we've already looked at Derrer in the printmaking section earlier, the lecture on printmaking. He was the one with those crazy, insanely detailed etchings that were just, how did you manage to etch that? That's so impressive, so much detail. Well, this is actually a painting, but it's from the same guy. And he was also one of the first to start signing his work, and you'll see that here. But he was German and further developed the practice of combining symbolism with realism using Italian techniques and beliefs, such as increasing belief in the artist as a creative individual. And like that, just like Michelangelo signing his work, he showed this by signing his work. And this was still incredibly uncommon at the time. Like, it was unheard of. In this piece, he actually signs it twice. On the left here, he's got his little, like, emblem that's a large A with it's like a capital A with a capital D that's smaller inside of it. And then on the right here, there's, like, his full name and, like, saying, like, I am the one who made this. It's like he put a watermark on it. It's like he put two watermarks on it. He wants you to know that he made this. And that was just very new at the time. People were like, what the heck is this guy doing? Why is he so full of himself? But, you know, he worked really hard on this. Of course he wants people to know that it's his. And this really is just going to show again and again, just driving home this point of humanism and this idea of the individual and the importance of the individual being something that's okay and even encouraged during this time. Now, let's look at something a little different than what we've been looking at. This is Pieter Brugel, and he worked with the lives and surroundings of common people with rich landscapes. So, this type of painting that is like mostly landscape but has some people in it and has this sort of style to it was referred to as genre paintings. And this is the only genre painting we'll look at right now just because we're covering so much, but I wanted to give you at least one example. This is Hunters in the Snow, which features both an illusion of deep space. It utilizes scale and vertical placement as well as atmospheric perspective to really give us that solid illusion of those mountains being way far back and these little hunting dogs being way up close. So we've already talked about atmospheric perspective, having things reduce in contrast as we get farther back, and also scale, having things get smaller as we get farther back, and vertical placement, things get placed a little bit higher up on the, the x-axis? The x-axis, horizontally, the farther they go back as well. And this also just very much captures the mood of the winter as it was experienced within this community, which is peaceful yet active, because you can see that the community is gathered outside, and but they still did need to go out and hunt or go out and do their blacksmithery, which is another thing that you can see kind of in the the far left-hand side in the middle. But with that, let's move on to Mannerism. This was kind of near the tail end of the Renaissance, like as things had already, the High Renaissance is already past and artists are just not sure how to top what's been done. Basically, artists extended and questioned the heritage of Raphael and Michelangelo. These masters were celebrated for seemingly reaching perfection, and young painters struggled with how to reach perfection after someone else has already reached perfection. So they started creating works in the manner of the preceding generation, and they would say this is in the manner of Raphael, or this is in the manner of Michelangelo, and that means that you're kind of like stylistically borrowing some of the aesthetic components of a piece, but you're making your own piece, but it's just kind of like in their style. It's in the manner of them. However, others rebelled and cultivated what they called mannered styles, which is when they did styles in their own manner. It would be, similar to what was going on at the time, but it was in their own way. And so this developed this new style that people called Mannerism. And here is an example of a very famous piece of Mannerism. This is Moses defending the daughters of Jethro, and this is by Rosso Fiorentino. And this really just shows a lot of the main components of Mannerism, having a lot of figures layered over each other, having a very drastically compressed space. So a lot of things that would normally go far back out into space, it's like everything is kind of very close to you. There is still some perspective to it in terms of like things that are farther away being smaller and stuff, but it's just all very in your face. Everything wants to be in the main subject matter pretty much. And also we start to see the use of foreshortening here. Foreshortening is the sort of visual phenomenon or effect of when you look at something that is coming towards you, as it gets closer to you, it appears to like grow in size. Like if you put your hand in front of you right now and put your fingers to your eye and your wrist away from your eye, the tips of your fingers are going to look bigger than they would if you had your fingers facing away from you. This is a bad example. Here's an example in the painting. So this man who's laying on the ground at the bottom right of the painting with his little penis out, That doesn't narrow it down. There are a lot of little penises out, but you know the man I'm talking about. He's laying there. He's been slain or something. Well, one of his legs, the one that's on the bottom, looks longer than the other. Now, that's not because that leg is actually, like, that thigh part is actually longer than the other. It's because the thigh that is on top is meant to be going back into space. So it appears shorter when in reality it is just becoming farther away. So that is foreshortening. Sorry if that was like a bad explanation. I can go over it again in class if it doesn't make sense. So, now that we've covered Mannerism, let's move on to Baroque. We're already so far into the video, and I'll try to keep it a little bit more brief as we go on, but there's just so much content to cover. So, take a break if you need to, and come back, and then we'll talk about Baroque. So, Baroque was the period of about 1600 to 1750. And in this time, art moved in the direction of drama, emotion, and splendor. Things just got a lot more dramatic. People set aside this really balanced harmony that Renaissance artists used in favor of innovative use of space. So there was foreshortening and sharp diagonal lines. And also this was happening at the same time as the Counter-Reformation of the Roman Catholic Church, and they kind of coincide. It just kind of makes sense for it to be happening at the same time as that. But let's talk about the Italian Baroque, because this is really kind of where Baroque, a lot of these things very much start flourishing in Italy and then move elsewhere. So, starting in Italy, we've got Caravaggio, who used a high level of realism and very dramatic use of light. He used directed light and made strong contrasts, and this is chiaroscuro. I've said the word several times, but if you can think of one artist, actually two, because the next artist we're going to talk about uses it just as much, and yet she doesn't get as much credit for it. But if you could think of one artist to define chiaroscuro, it is Caravaggio. He mastered chiaroscuro. He set the precedent for what chiaroscuro even was. Now, this example is the conversion of St. Paul. So, if you don't know, the biblical reference is that Paul was originally called Saul, and he was like a really bad guy, but then he saw the light of God and became blinded and fell off his horse and stuff, and then he immediately changed everything about himself and became a godly man, and he found Jesus, and Jesus renamed him Paul and unblinded him, and that's how Paul came to be. Anyway, this is the moment where he's been blinded by God and fallen off his horse. And there is just a lot of drama here. And also the figure of him is foreshortened. His legs have that foreshortening effect that I was talking about, so that you can tell that they're going back into space, to make his body seem realistic to the viewer. And there's also this emotional realism in this piece. It's so emotional and dramatic in a way that we just weren't used to. And this was perceived by some as too strong for those that were accustomed to images representing the inner spirituality of a character with a relatively emotionless expression. Like I was saying about David, oh, he's got so much going on in his mind, but he's actually got a very blank facial expression, and people were just kind of projecting that onto what they thought he was thinking. And you can even think back to the giant head of the Emperor Constantine, and how he was supposed to, it represents that he's got so much spirituality in his mind, and it's he's making, the blankest face ever, he's watching a tutorial on how to plunge a toilet. It's he's just so bored and blank-faced, but people were really used to that, and then people started seeing this really highly emotional work, and they were oh no, it is too much. And to amp it up even more, before I move on, apparently some stuff has come out recently. Some historians are saying that Caravaggio might have been a murderer. I don't actually fully know what's up with that, because this is very new discovery. But I like to keep it real with you guys and tell you when it's like a good artist, bad person scenario, and it sounds like this might unfortunately be another case of that. So just putting that out there. But anyway, another artist that was highly influenced by Caravaggio and really mastered the use of chiaroscuro is Artemisia Gentileschi. And oh, she's one of my favorites. So this example is Judith and the maidservant with the head of Holofernes. You can tell she's influenced by Caravaggio with the dramatic lighting and the off-balanced composition. And this is actually a scene from the Old Testament in which the character Judith beheaded the Assyrian general Holofernes, and her maidservant helped her, and right now her maidservant is like holding his beheaded head, and she's like making sure no one's coming in at the moment. And she's still got the sword that she beheaded him with. And pretty soon we'll look at another piece of Artemisia Gentileschi's in which it's actually Judith slaying Holofernes, like it's the moment that she's beheading him. And it is so much more emotional than any other portrayal of this scene, because a lot of people made pieces of Judith slaying Holofernes, and none of them were as brutal as Artemisia Gentileschi's. And I think a lot of that is because she understood the ache of being a woman probably more than she should have. And with that, I am gonna move to the next image. So I am gonna tell you guys Artemisia Gentileschi's story, but I want to warn you that it is, if sexual assault is a trigger for you or torture, and you like won't be okay if you watch this, then just mute this slide until it changes to the next one so that you don't have to hear it. You're not going to be tested on this. I just want her story to be told to those who feel comfortable hearing it. I think it's important that these things get talked about and get addressed, but I also don't want to put anyone in a state where they might like have a panic attack or a flashback or something. So just do what you need to do. Mute the slide if you have to, and then unmute it when we get to the next one. But if you're still here, I want to tell you a little bit about Artemisia Gentileschi. Now, you might have noticed that she's really the first woman painter or artist that was famous enough to make it into the book in terms of like the chronology of art history from beginning to end. And you know, it's a male-dominated field, and it has been for a very long time, and it was so much then as well. And it's very, very impressive that she managed to have the level of success that she did at the time that she was alive. And part of this can be attributed to the fact that her father was an artist and she had access to arts education in a sense. Most people go for apprenticeships with artists that they look up to at this time, like in this time in history. People would go to apprenticeships. She didn't have access to that being a woman, but she did have an art tutor that helped her hone her skills and learn to paint. However, very unfortunately, Artemisia Gentileschi was pretty horrifically sexually abused by her painting tutor, by her art tutor. The person that taught her to paint or helped her hone her natural skills raped her. And at the time, and unfortunately still now, but it's gotten a lot better, but rape was like a very normal part of the culture. And I say unfortunately still now because, you know, you'd think it'd be so much better, but it's not that much better. It's better than it was, that's for sure. But it was very much a time of victim blaming. And when Gentileschi tried to come forward about the fact that she had been sexually abused, they had this whole like court case type of thing, like trying to prove, and they came to the conclusion that she made it all up and that she was faking, and that she had brought such dishonor on her family and on everyone around that they tortured her. And not only did they torture her, but they tortured her hands. And if you can imagine, as an artist that works with your hands, to have like your fingers and your fingernails and your finger bones tortured in that way, not only does it hurt, but it destroys the rest of your career. So I'm mainly telling this story because it's kind of a tale as old as time, and it's a tale that you'll see repeated again and again through art history, is women artists being taken advantage of, whether it be sexually or in other ways, and then being blamed for it, and then having their careers cut short or having themselves be silenced in a way. And I think that, it's not right to pigeonhole Artemisia Gentileschi by assuming that all of her work is about her trauma, but I do think that it gives a lot of context as to how, this is the most brutal slaying of Holofernes that we've seen in art history, Caravaggio also made this scene, and you would think that Judith was like just cutting a sandwich. This is like, she's really like leaning over, like it's, and some x-rays of this piece show that it was even more emotional and gruesome, and that she painted over it and made it more tame, probably at the recommendation or command of someone else. So yeah, that's a very important story, I believe, for us to know and to remember what happened to her, and remember her as a great painter, not a great woman painter, but a great painter in and of itself, and being held back simply for the fact that she was a woman. But I also recognize that this story could have been very triggering to some people, so I wanted to give people an excuse to not listen to it if it was going to upset them. However, with that being said and done, let's move on, because I don't know, that's enough of that. So we're on to the next slide. I'm going to give a few seconds for anyone who did mute this to like recognize that, oh, it's switched to the next slide, so that they can now unmute it. I'm assuming we're all back now. But this is let's just hop right back into the Italian Baroque and not pretend that we didn't just hear a very upsetting story, but just move on to the rest of art history because we have to. So, this is Bernini. This is Gian Lorenzo Bernini. This isn't him. This is made by him. This is made by Bernini. And this is also another depiction of David. And Bernini, as a sculptor, was as influential as Caravaggio was in painting. He made the same level of influence on everyone else, just in terms of sculpture. And this is also a very different depiction of David than we've seen before. It's life-size, it's not huge and monumental, but also this twisted body and facial expression depicts the drama of struggle. He's not standing there after having already won. He's truly struggling in this moment. And this, I think, helps show this real shift when we get to Baroque, to the more emotional and active, it feels more like an action shot, and there's just a lot more expression in this, and that's really what defines Baroque as opposed to the Renaissance that came before it. So just the drama, the expression, the emotion, that's really what makes it Baroque. Now, still talking about Bernini, his elaborate and complex structures were the climax of the Italian Baroque expression. He was peak Baroque. And a great example of this is the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. And the intensity of the art is apparent here. It's a highly emotionally charged piece as well, but in a different way. This is actually a portrayal of a vision from St. Teresa's diary. In her vision, she saw an angel who pierced her heart with a flaming arrow of gold, which gave her great pain yet pleasure at the same time, and it left her, quote, all on fire with a great love for God. And so this moment in which her heart is pierced with the flaming arrow of the understanding of God is quite literally considered to be like almost orgasmic in St. Teresa's experience. So that's you can really see it here, like in the facial expression she's making, and the skylight adds to the drama of the sculpture, and you're really seeing it at the moment of the greatest emotional impact. But it's a sexualized image, and I think that this is just like another example of how, using biblical tales, artists would oftentimes, like at this time, use that as a thinly veiled excuse to show something sexual. Things that you think you shouldn't sexualize, like, religion or whatever, they would make it sexual, and it's very much made sexual in this one. But this is overall just a departure from the classical norm that influenced sculptors throughout Europe. And it's an important piece to know. And it also is just getting into this like highly emotional facial expressions instead of everyone having these bland, just bored facial expressions. Now let's talk a bit about the Baroque in Flanders and the Netherlands. Because, like I said, how things kind of started in Italy and then trickled out to other places, this is that. So this is a piece by Peter Paul Rubens. He was a highly demanded European artist, constantly being commissioned by different patrons. And this piece is called The Raising of the Cross. And in it, everyone is so ripped. Like, there's these really sensual, well-muscled figures. And this is supposedly a result of viewing works by Michelangelo and Caravaggio, which both really emphasize the muscles. But, I mean, everyone was emphasizing the muscly men during all of this. So, of course, this image of Jesus being hung on the cross is, like, really muscly and, like, kind of homoerotic in the fact that it's showing all of these, like, beautiful male bodies. Even Jesus is ripped, and he's, like, being tortured. So, yeah, it's a thing. They would use any reason to make something sexual out of something religious. It just happens so much, and I sound crazy for it, but it really is a thing, I promise. And also, a last thing to note here is that there's just a high degree of realistic detail, which actually was a lot of traditions in the Flemish heritage of painting were, like, put into this. So the way that he, the techniques he used to put this level of detail were, like, of Flemish tradition. Now, another Baroque artist in Flanders and the Netherlands is Jan Vermeer. Now, these genre paintings that I talked about before that had just, like, things of daily life, like whether it be a landscape or just, like, people existing in a place. It's just something that's secular, but also not, like, mythology or anything. It's just, like, day-to-day stuff. That was genre paintings. And they raised daily life to a great solemnity in the Netherlands here, and they really concentrated on the way that the light reveals each color, texture, in detail. So there's a lot of care and attention put into the light specifically here, and the way it affects everything else, the way it affects the color and the texture. And Vermeer's images oftentimes, and especially in this case, had a very clear but luminous sort of vitality to them. There's something like living about this piece. And it's really just all in the light. This piece is called The Kitchen Maid, and in it the light has just this very mystical quality. And it makes pouring milk, something so simple, seem like some kind of solemn ritual. So that is kind of wrapping up the Baroque in Flanders and the Netherlands. Let's talk about the Baroque in Spain and France. And I swear we're almost done, guys. We got this. Okay. But in Spain and France, in the Baroque tradition, the still life flourished. So you know by now, you've made a still life by now. A still life is an image of inanimate objects put together. Oftentimes it'd be fruits or flowers as subject arranged by the artist, often including domestic and or food items. And in the Netherlands, they would normally have these still lifes be kind of celebrating the bounty of nature. But in Spain, they would isolate a few items and put them in this dramatic lighting and have a very different kind of mood to it. And a great example of this that we're looking at now is Juan Van Der Hemen, who you can see influences from both Spanish and Dutch schools. This is still life with sweets and pottery. And I think the main thing to note is the lighting. It's not exactly chiaroscuro, but it's close. It's this very stark lighting with a very bare setting. And all of these rich bowls of fruit and pastries, just so much intrigue and so much texture there. Now, if we had more time and we weren't already over an hour into this lecture, I would love to tell you guys about the tradition of Vanitas still lives, specifically Dutch Vanitas still lives. But we're just covering so much today and so much in general that I don't know if we can get to it. But to put it really quickly, just I gotta squeeze it in there, I'm sorry. To put it really quickly, it's like a sort of memento mori situation, like a remember that like life is beautiful, but death is just around the corner. And so they would have like still lives of flowers, but some of the flowers would be wilting, or like fruit, but some of the fruit would be rotting, and there'd be like a skull because you're gonna die someday and become one. And they'd have like coins because the money is futile in a world where we all die eventually. And that is Vanitas still lives. Had to throw it in there really quick. You're not going to be tested on that. I just wanted you to know. I just want you guys to know, okay? Now, we have finally reached Rococo. I swear there's only 2 more slides. We got this. We are at Rococo. And this is a fun place to end because Rococo is like a very light, playful version of Baroque. It's like Baroque, but make it less emotional and more frilly and pastel. It's very over the top with decorative beauty and really values the finer things in life, so to speak. There would often be this imitation of curved shapes or shells. That was like a sort of visual motif that would repeat. And also, this was a time when the arts moved from these marble halls of huge, like, galleria type of situations to fashionable townhouses. And were really brought into the homes, but specifically of the rich, as the highest of the high class were able to afford it. And the first step of Rococo is just have a ton of money, because this stuff is so ornate and so elaborate. This example is the Hotel de Soubise, and this room specifically is the Salon de la Princesse, so it's the princess's room, and it's a very romantic, like you think of like French aristocrats with their big poofy dresses and their like ridiculous tall white wigs. That's Rococo. Add ruffles, add gold, and make it like some light pink or light blue or something. It's Rococo. You got it. And this particular example is like these very romantic visions of just a life free from hardship, where you're just so rich you don't have to worry about anything, and all you have to do is giggle and eat pastries and swing on a swing set, which is the next thing that we're going to look at. This is the most famous Rococo painting ever, pretty much. Yeah. This is Fragonard's Happy Accidents of the Swing. People oftentimes just refer to it as the swing, but the full name is Happy Accidents of the Swing. And this embodies everything about Rococo. It's flirty. It's arguably romantic. I think the romantic element of it is kind of gross. I'll get into that. But, some would say it's romantic. And above all else, it's fancy. That dress has so many ruffles. Her little fancy hat, so fancy. Everything about Rococo is just fancy. So, in the swing, or Happy Accidents of the Swing, you see a well-dressed, idle young woman who's admired by a hiding youth. So there's the guy who's pulling her on the swing. She clearly knows that he's there because someone's pulling the ropes to make the swing go. But she supposedly does not know that this man here in the bottom left corner is here spying on her and currently looking up her skirt. That's what I meant by gross. But, voyeurism was like super normal, and spying on ladies and violating their privacy, super normal at the time, so they thought it was romantic or whatever. But she is swinging. She has not a care in the world because all she has to do in life is just wear pretty clothes and swing on swings, and that's just the life. That's just the life you want to live. That's the Rococo life. And she has just kicked off her shoe while swinging, and the sort of storyline here is that we are catching this exact moment where her shoe is in the air, and it looks like at the trajectory that the shoe is going that it's probably going to fall on this young man's face that's spying on her. And so there's this kind of tension, knowing that like the second after, if this were a photograph, the second after it was taken, the guy would have been hit in the face with a shoe, probably said something, and then she would immediately know that he's there. So that's the sort of story here. And it really contrasts light and dark here and has that off-balance composition similar to chiaroscuro, but it's just so like flouncy and romantic, and just, it's not that like dark, gripping, emotional style that Baroque had. It's like, it's Baroque's cute pastel sister is Rococo. So that's Rococo. That's a good place to end. I know that this was a lot of content to cover, so I apologize for that, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to talking to you all in class about it. And with that, have a good one.